Good morning, everybody. Today we are the day 3 session of the multidisciplinary webinar series for social sciences. And we have Dr. Samuel Jacob Kuruvilla of Kerala University. Dr. Samuel Jacob Kuruvilla is the Assistant Professor of Department of Political Science of Kerala University. And he will be the topic multiculturalism and secularism. And without much ado, I request Dr. Samuel Jacob Kuruvilla to hand over the session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anak. I'm very honored to be in this open session conducted by the IQAC of Maharaja's College, Ernakulam. And I would like to welcome one and all who are listening to this presentation. My topic is indeed a very extremely relevant topic in the present day and age. Particularly in the country in which we are living in right now, and in the times in which we are living in right now. We are seeing continual challenges to the practice of Indian secularism, and we are constantly facing questions about the nature of our form of practice of secularism, as well as the kind of multiculturalism that we see prevalent in our country. When we think of these two terms, secularism and multiculturalism, and we look across the world, right, we can see many different ideas about the practice of secularism and about the state of multiculturalism as it is prevalent in different parts of the world. So what I thought is I will first talk from an international perspective, and then I will come to a national perspective, right? When we look to the West, right, when we sit here in the East and we look to the West, and at the Western practice of secularism as well as multiculturalism, what we see is, we just need to take the case of two countries. One country is no longer there functioning as a country. I'm talking about the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union. And the other country is the United States of America, right? The Soviet Union, of course, was an overtly secular nation. Indeed, a country where there was no popular acceptance of religion and religious activities. But of course, a country which, for all practical purposes, tolerated the practice of religion to a certain extent, right? That was the kind of situation that we saw in the Soviet Union. And when we think back and we think about how the Soviet Union was set up as a union of disparate republics that came together as a result of a revolution in the former Russian Empire, and which later expanded. So the Soviet Union expanded as a result of various activities, various political activities, as a result of war. It expanded and it formed a very vast multicultural nation that extended across the globe, across 1/4 of the globe, and embraced multitudes of ethnic groups and languages and various religions also within a avowedly secular framework, right? So that was the Soviet experiment. Religion was not encouraged, but was tolerated. And ethnic diversity was also tolerated within the constitution of the Soviet Union. But then at the same time, one particular language, right? One language, Russian, was the official language of the Soviet Union, and thereby Russian culture, um, a secular Russian culture, was also sought to be imprinted and imposed across the territories of the Soviet Union, right? So again, when we come to the present context, after the disintegration of the Soviet Union, what we see is across the nations of the former Soviet sphere, what you can see today is the still prevalence of the Russian language as a bond of unification, cultural unification among the various former Soviet republics that are today independent nation states, right? And at the same time, we also have to keep in mind that the Soviet experiment failed, right? The Soviet Union collapsed due to various reasons. But the rump nation that succeeded the Soviet Union, meaning, of course, today's Russian Federation, continued to have many different republics, ethnic groups, and different people of different religious orientations within the framework of a federal nation state, right? So when we compare today's Russia, and of course in today's Russia, religion is an accepted fact. Whereas there is no official state religion, but it is understood that Christianity of the Orthodox persuasion is more or less seen as the state sanctioned or state accepted religion, is promoted by the state in various ways. But along with that, Islam is also accepted as an official religion, and Islam is tolerated, right? So, but then again, there are limits to toleration of religious viewpoints in the present Russian Federation. Other than the three official religions of Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism, there are tendencies in the Russian Federation today towards an intolerance of diverse religious views, as well as an intolerance of diverse sexual natures, right? We can clearly see that kind of intolerance in today's Russian Federation, right? And then again, coming to the West, coming to the Western nations and to the United States as another example, what we see is we see something that indeed that has been termed a moderate secularism, right? And of course, I'm talking about Rajiv Bhargava's book in 2009, where he talks about the religious liberty and secularism of the United States, as well as the equality of citizenship secularism, or what is known as licit of France, right? Now, in both these contexts, and particularly in the case of France, in the modern context, we can see a lot of debate about the nature of French secularism and the acceptance of the French values, the French revolutionary values, and the concept of citizenship secularism, and how much has this been accepted by the ethnic minorities and the religious minorities in France. So again, when I make this speech, I'm assuming that those who listen to me are aware to a certain extent about these ongoing discussions and controversies, right? Anybody who has read or who regularly reads the newspapers and watches the news will be aware of this, right? So when we take the case of Western nations, what we have to keep in mind is religion and the religious establishment has been incorporated into the national life of most of the major Western nations. So whether it is the case of the United States, whether it's the case of France, whether it is the case of Germany, in all these nations and other nations as well, you can see varying forms of secularism, right? In some nations, there is an official church, right? So religion has been given a constitutionally recognized position. Indeed, terminology has been used such that the church is a constitutionally recognized corporation, right? The church in certain Western countries is a constitutionally recognized corporation, which means that the government from the national exchequer is constitutionally mandated to collect taxes and also to distribute large amounts of public monies, right, for the maintenance of the infrastructure of the religious establishment. One thing we need to remember here is when we look at the West, minority religions are a relatively new phenomenon in the West. So you have a all-dominant majority religion, and the various minority religions, most prominent of which is Islam, are relatively new entrants into the Western consciousness, and thereby the West is still grappling with the phenomenon of minorityism and minority viewpoints and minority religions, and also is still grappling with the phenomenon of how to incorporate minority views, minority religious views into the national discourse of these nations, right? So, I mean, if you take the case of the United States, you know, the Constitution of the United States clearly mentions the name of God, right? And the fact that the nation is or was created in the name of God. And whereas there is no official church in the United States, but when we look at the various programs of the American government, when we look at the functioning of the American government, and when we look at the various ceremonies that are conducted by the American government, you know, for example, in the inauguration of the president, right? It always starts with a prayer, right? And whereas the Constitution of the United States makes it very clear about the separation of church and state. Indeed, the founding fathers were particularly that was one of the very important issues that that concerned the founding fathers of the United States. But when it comes to the practice of secularism, right? When it comes to the actual practice of secularism, Western nations, are in a kind of a dilemma at this moment, right? Dilemma, when I said dilemma, what I meant was that they are still negotiating, right? They are still negotiating the kind of secularism that they can practice or they are supposed to practice in what is a newly multicultural framework. Now, for the example, is the best example is the United States, where, as we all know, within the, or possibly before the first half of this century ends, right? Possibly by the middle of this century, the so-called white majority, white cultural majority, or white Christian, I won't use the word Christian, but the ethnically white majority in the United States will be reduced to a minority, and non-whites will together form, right? Will together form a majority in the United States, right? Which means that the nature of the United States and its government is set to radically change, right, in the coming decades, right? So again, if I were to come back to Rajiv Bhargava and what he said about Western secularism, which he called moderate secularism, and not only him, but Tariq Modood has also used the same terminology, right, to refer to Western secularism as moderate secularism, and particularly in the case of the West European nations, right? Okay, so again, when I come back to that particular framework, and again, I'm talking about the nations of Western Europe. In all these nations, well before the arrival of minorities, right? Well before the arrival of people from the East and from the Eastern and Southern hemispheres of the world into these nations had evolved a system of governance and administration, right? And religious toleration based on a large majoritarian acceptance of religion, right? So what I'm of course meaning is, when we look at the history of the West in the last 500 years or so, right? Many of us will be aware that the West went through a very bloody period of religious turmoil, right? Religious turmoil, bloody wars, which eventually culminated in an acceptance of diverse views within a majoritarian framework, right? So of course, like, I'm talking about for example, the English case, where from the 17th century onwards, right? The 17th century was a particularly bloody period in English political life, religious and political life. And finally, the English came round to an acceptance of a official church and an official religion, and incorporated that into the governance setup, right? And then if we were to fast forward into the 20th century, it was predominantly after the Second World War, right? It was predominantly after the Second World War that, due to a tremendous loss of manpower in the West, and due to various other factors like the decolonization of many nations in the south and the east, right? We saw a transfer of manpower, right? Transfer of manpower, transfer of people, migration of people from the east and the south to the west, right? And now Western nations have to contend with a newly acquired diversity, right? A newly acquired diversity, a diversity of religion, a diversity of ethnic orientations, right? Diverse ethnic groups and diverse religious groups have now arrived in the West, right? So now the whole question is about multiculturalism, right? Western secularism has more or less been cemented, and they have, you know, come towards a analysis or a description of moderate secularism. But now the question is how to accommodate the diverse new groups, new religions, or new from a Western point of view, the diverse religions that have now come up or that have now settled in the West. And of course, in this context, we have to think about the well-entrenched tendency of Islamophobia that was prevalent in the West, right? Because, you know, because of historical reasons and because historically the rise of Islam has always clashed with the West, right? Because Islam and the Islamic civilizations have taken over, historically have taken over many nations that were within the Western sphere of influence. Historically, there has been this concept or this tendency known as Islamophobia, right? The intense suspicion of Islam and Islamic nations in the West, right? And of course, there was the backlash, right? You know, after the rise of Islam and, you know, after the golden age of Islam, you had the decline of Islam, which coincided with the rise of the West. And Western nations were able to, shall we say, retake, right, or reconquer many parts of the world that were within the Islamic sphere of influence. And then, you know, we come to a state of stalemate, right, where, you know, the area of Islam is more or less well defined, and the area of the West is again more or less well defined, right? And then comes the post Second World War period, when large scale migration or immigration takes place from the Middle East, from Africa, and of course from South Asia. And newly arriving diverse populations in the West, you know, of whom there are different religious groups. There are Muslims, there are Hindus, right? There are even Christians. They all arrive in the West, but they look different, right? They are culturally different, ethnically different, and most important of all, visually different from the predominant populations in the West, right? So multiculturalism as a new ideology acquires a marked interest in the West, right? Why? Because you have a new situation in the West where we have diverse groups of people, right? So then, in the last 50 to 75 years or so, ever since the end of the Second World War, right, this whole debate about multiculturalism takes place, right? Multiculturalism versus the moderate secularism that is practiced in the West. And of course, in the present context, especially post the Syrian civil war, we have seen how vast numbers, right? More than 1 million Syrian refugees have found a solace in the West, along with refugees from Iraq, from Afghanistan, right, from Libya, from wherever there are, whichever nations, predominantly in the Middle East, where there are serious civil issues, where there is civil strife, we can clearly see large-scale migration of people to the Western nations, right? And thereby the whole struggle to accommodate these people in the various nations of the West, and the differing ways in which these people have been accommodated in the Western nations. So, of course, when I talk about the West, the West is never a monolithic phenomenon, right? The 27 nations that comprise the European Union today, that numerical, the numeric itself has such symbolism. A union of 27 nations, right? More or less, you can say that a union of 27 major languages also, though many of the nations speak the same language also. But at the same time, such a diversity is embodied in the European Union, right? And the European Union as a administrative framework, as an administrative entity, is certainly a liberal, is certainly in a liberal democratic framework. With the various organizations, with the various administrative bodies of a liberal democracy. But within the various nations of the European Union, you see differing tendencies towards accepting ethnic minorities, right? So many examples come to my mind. Particularly if we look towards the south and the east of the European Union, right? If you take the case of Greece, right? If you take the case of Greece and you take the case of Bulgaria, I'm just randomly choosing two nations just to give you two examples, right? These two nations, Greece and Bulgaria, have ethno-religious minorities within them, right? I'm just giving these two nations as two examples. I'm just giving you these two nations as two examples. These two nations have ethno-religious minorities living within their frameworks, within the nations. But the approach of these nations towards their ethno-religious minorities put these nations apart from the rest of Europe. Now, in the case of Greece, right, there is a Turkish minority in Greece. There's a Turkish minority in what is known as Western Thrace in Greece. Western Thrace is that region of Greece that borders the Republic of Turkey, very close to the Bosphorus. And it is largely populated by ethnic Turks, right? And the approach of the Greek government of the Hellenic Republic towards these people, is to define them as Greek Muslims. So, that is the state denies that they are Turks, right? Though these people are very determined to emphasize their Turkish origins, and that the fact that they are Turkish speakers, and that they are Turks. But the state insists on calling them Greeks of Muslim persuasion, right? So you have a very a dilemma, a situation of a dilemma for these people where their very ethnicity is questioned, right? And they face, many the Greek state, and the prime complaint is the fact that their very ethnicity, their origins are questioned. The state is unwilling to accept the fact that there are non-Greeks settled on their territory, right? So the state has a major issue when you come to the question of multiculturalism. And when you take up the case of secularism, Greece is a nation that has an official religion, right? And the official religion is Orthodox Christianity. So, there is a situation like, you take the case of Athens, the capital of Greece, and you will find that there is not a single mosque in Athens, right? And again, this very syndrome is prevalent across many Western nations where, when minority groups submit applications to build places of worship, what we see is the state insists that whatever places of worship are built, minority places of worship that seek to be built, should not be built in the traditional architectural settings of these ethnic groups. Now, for example, when a mosque is sought to be built, the minar is a very important part of a mosque, right? Now there are similarities of the minar in Christian architecture as well, where you have church steeples, right? And those of us who are familiar with the Western landscape will know that the Western nations are, there are literally thousands, if not millions, hundreds of thousands of churches in the West, right? Many of these churches have steeples. Many of the churches are also not used at all. They are remnants of a period when the large population of the West were religious and and had to, of necessity, go to church. Right? But now most of these are empty structures, left and protected by the state for various reasons, right? But when minority groups come forward, right, to either build new structures or to convert existing churches to mosques, right, then one often comes across, shall we say, opposition from local bodies, and indeed from the state that any new structures should conform to the largely accepted architectural settings of the Western nations, right? So, for example, if a mosque is going to be built and the question of the minar comes up, then there will be lots of issues about a minar, right? A minar, I'm talking from personal experience, having spent time in the West and heard some of the complaints or some of the issues that have been raised by Muslims in the UK about being unable to build structures according to their wishes, right? According to their culturally accepted religious and other cultural specifications, right? If a mosque is sought to be built, then that should not be a minar, right? Or if at all a minar is there, it should look like a church steeple, right? So these are issues that often crop up, and in certain countries, indeed, it's very difficult to build a mosque, right? The West, of course. I mean, yeah. So what I'm trying to bring out here is multiculturalism. When we think of it from an Indian point of view, from a South Asian point of view, multiculturalism is something that has been ingrained in our national consciousness, right? Particularly here in India, right? I'm of course talking about India pre-partition as well as India post-partition, right? For us, in mainland India, right, mainland South Asia, we are attuned to living among different people of different religious persuasions, attuned to seeing people of varying ethnic origins, right? People of varying skin colors. We are attuned to tremendous diversity in our South Asian framework. And of course, see, I'm not going into the specifics of post-partition that, certain nations in South Asia have become extremely monocultural. All that is there, I acknowledge that. But I'm talking about South Asia as a cultural zone, right? And there is a reason for this, because I can very well remember in my experience of living in the West, right? Once you pass the borders of South Asia, once you go to the West, it doesn't matter whether you're an Indian or a Pakistani or a Bangladeshi, right? You are all Pakis. And I'm using a very derogatory term. This has been my experience, right? And in the West, people are not concerned about whether you are Indian or Pakistani or Bangladeshi. You're all the same. You look the same. And indeed, in my experience, I have, come across so many brothers, right? Brothers and sisters from our neighboring countries, who have treated me wonderfully, right? And who have made me feel so much at home. So when we are here in India or when we are here in South Asia, we often have a false feeling that we are always fighting with each other. There is no acceptance among the countries of South Asia. At a political framework, this might be true. But once we are transferred, once we are plucked from this setting and we are in the West, right? All these differences tend to, practically disappear, and we all tend to be the same, right? Vis-a-vis the people of the West. Okay, I just made these comments in passing. Now, again, coming back to our particular context. The argument I'm trying to make here is, in South Asia, we have a particular setting in which we are attuned to diversity, for the simple reason that throughout our history, myriad groups of people have come and gone through this part of the world, right? Because our peninsula is located, right between the west on one side and the east on the other side. And all those who needed to travel to the east had to come in through us and then exit via us to the east. So we have been at a particular turning point, or we in India have been an entrepot, right? We have been an entrepot of various differing kinds of people and ethnic groups, right? And this is of particular relevance to our own state, here in Kerala, where, as we all know, we have been exposed to so many international influences, right, over the ages. So tolerance for differing religious, cultural, ethnic viewpoints have been ingrained into our DNA, so as to speak. I'm not saying that that there is no intolerance in India. I'm not saying anything like that. I'm just saying that acceptance of diverse religious views are part and parcel of the ethno-cultural makeup of the vast majority of people of the South Asian subcontinent, right? But this has not been the case in the West, right? Where, on the contrary, it was a case of extreme suspicion of anybody who looked different from you, right? And what we see is, in the West, over the last 50 to 75 years, we've seen a scenario where people have had to be re-educated, right? For example, in the present context, especially after the BLM movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, what we can see, and particularly in the present pandemic situation, we have seen that a major focus in the Western setting has been on trying to re-educate people about diversity, diverse views, about ensuring that people who are different, whether culturally, sexually, linguistically, and otherwise, are granted sufficient acceptance in the West, right? And this whole debate about integration, in the West, there has been different debates about multiculturalism, right? One debate was about integration, right? That if anybody comes to the West from the East or the South, right, that individual or group needs to be integrated into the Western setting, right? Integrated by meaning that the group should be should be enforced to learn the language, should be assimilated, right? So that concept or issue about, or the whole concept of assimilation, that minorities should be assimilated to the extent that they will cease to be minorities, right? And historically, when we see what happened in the West, whenever minorities have come to the West, and I'm talking about the pre-Second World War period, when there were very limited numbers of minorities, it was always a case of them getting assimilated, right? Even in the present context, if you were to take the case of the United Kingdom, the largest growing group in the United Kingdom today are the so-called mixed race group, where either one of the parents of a particular person will be belonging to different ethnic groups. So mixed race people are the largest growing group in the United Kingdom today. Right? Now, if you were to transfer this syndrome to America, you would find that mixed race marriages do happen there, but to a remarkably lesser extent. And anybody of mixed origin would be automatically classified as black. Right? So they wouldn't get the white tag, right? Unless they were particularly fair-skinned and could masquerade as white. So racial divisions in the United States are still much more dominant than they are in, shall we say, in the United Kingdom. So what you see there is a more, shall we say, a more accepting society, right? But a society where the racial divisions are less marked, right? But at the same time, racial divisions are there, And then, if I were to come to the case of France, right? Right now, France is very much in the picture because of the particular activism of the present French president and his desire to ensure that the values of the French Republic, right, the values of the French Revolution are understood and accepted by the minorities in France, right? So, this whole debate about freedom of speech, the issues that are going on in France right now about freedom of speech and the fact that, the French insist that it should be acceptable to, it should be acceptable to denigrate religion and religious individuals, right? It should be acceptable to question religious views. Vis-a-vis for example, our own context here, where in India, our definition of secularism is to respect all religions, right? To respect religions, and freedom of speech cannot be to the extent that you will knowingly pain the religious views of another community. So in France today, what we see is the whole debate around freedom of speech And the French are insistent that freedom of speech can be extended to the area of religion as well. And you should be allowed to question religious views that are considered given. But when we compare this with the Indian and South Asian, and indeed the views about freedom of speech that are prevalent across many nations of the East and the Southern Hemisphere, right? We clearly see a difference, because here toleration, tolerance, multiculturalism, indeed secularism, all these terminologies stand for respect for different religious views, right? Respect for and tolerance for different religions, different practices of religion, for differing views about how one practices one's culture and religion, right? Whereas when you take the case of the present ongoing controversy in France, the whole discussion there is about a sort of militant secularism, and to insist that Republican values and the values of the French Revolution should be practiced and enforced on all sections of the perspective of their ethnic identity and religious orientation. Right, so clearly you can see a difference of perception between the practice of secularism and multiculturalism in the Eastern Hemisphere, Western Hemisphere. You can clearly see a difference in how questions of secularism and multiculturalism are practiced in the Eastern and Western hemispheres. Now, I have not gone into the detailed specifics of the theoretical underpinnings of these concepts. I have not gone into that. I've sought to give a general discussion, right? And I have not focused on the situation, the present situation in the so-called Islamic world or in the Muslim world. And my reason for this is today's Muslim world is in a state of tremendous conflict and flux, right? And the prime reason for this conflict and flux is the fact that there is as yet no acceptable form of governance in the Islamic world, right? Various forms of governance have been practiced, are being practiced, but the Islamic world is still in a state of flux, regarding a final acceptance of a durable form of governance, right? And we see various forms of governance spread across the Islamic world. We see autocratic regimes, we see kingdoms, we see Islamic states, Islamic republics, monarchies. We see so many different kinds of forms of governance, right? And regarding the question of secularism and multiculturalism, we can see that the Islamic world is in a state of flux in this concept, regarding this, because there are states where there is a large amount of tolerance for differing views, but there are also states where tolerance is limited, right? And there are the practice of tolerance also varies, from state to state. I cannot end this discussion without mentioning the fact that the Islamic world of today is really different from the Islamic world of the mid 19th century, for example, which was more than 50% of the Ottoman Empire, or at least 50% of the former Ottoman Empire, was not Muslim. They were non-Muslims. They were Christians. There were large populations of Christians in the former Ottoman Empire, almost 50%. Right. So, though the Ottoman Empire was an Islamic state where Islam was the official state-sponsored religion, but in the mid 19th century, more than 50% of the Ottoman Empire was non-Muslim. And then, as a result of the clash with the West, the Islamic world lost its minorities. Right, the minority component is drastically reduced. So many nations achieved independence, and within the large states that multicultural, minorities, the number of minorities started to be reduced significantly. Right. So even in this present context, when we take the case of nations like Egypt and Syria prior to the civil war, right? These are two nations that still possessed large numbers of Christian minorities. But even in Egypt today, the Christian minorities still exist. But the governance is the issue. The form of governance is still under debate, right? And the extent of tolerance is also debatable. So I think I have made a long general discussion, and I think I can stop. Right? It's 1 hour. No doubt there are questions which I hope I'll be able to answer. So thank you for listening, one and all. The organizers can take control now. Because, I cannot see any questions. I don't know whether there are questions, or maybe the organizers can alert me as to the questions. Can the organizers take control?
Yeah, hi, sir.
Yeah.
So we have two questions.
Anak, I've ended my presentation. If there are any questions, I can try to answer them.
As of now, you can drop your questions. First question is, the idea of individualism perpetuated by the nation could produce a masculine paradigm. Do we need a political reconsideration of grief? By Victor Banerjee. And in continuation, there is another question. Also, do you think the mobilization of grief of the subalternity can form a different level of...
Have you muted yourself? Because I'm not able to hear you.
Sir, am I audible?
I'm still not audible. I cannot hear you, Anak. I don't know whether the problem is on my side. But on my side, I think everything is clear.
Am I audible, actually?
You can hear me, right?
Yeah, I can hear you, but can you hear me?
Okay, then you just chat in the chat box, because I can't hear you. I don't know why. I can see you, and you are mildly audible, but I cannot hear you very well.
Sir, am I audible? Am I audible?
I can't hear you. Some technical issue.
Might be.
If there are
Am I
any
audible now?
questions, it would be good if it can be put in the chat box.
Am I audible, sir? I think sir has left.
Now I think you can hear.
Can you hear me, sir?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. So the
Yeah.
first question, the idea of individualism perpetuated by the nation-state discourse produced a masculine paradigm. Do we need a political reconsideration of grief?
Okay, Anag, is that question visible in the chat? Is it visible in the chat? Oh, okay, I can see the chat now. Right. Which is the question?
So the question is, the idea of individualism by Victor Banerjee. The idea of individualism perpetuated by the nation-state discourse produced a masculine paradigm. Do we need a political reconsideration of grief?
Right. Do we need a political reconsideration of grief? To be frank, I'm not familiar with this, with what Victor Banerjee is referring to. I can understand this masculine paradigm that he's referring to. Yeah, I would agree that definitely we do need a political reconsideration of the kind of paradigm, masculine paradigm that is, evident in the nation-state discourse. Yes. I hope that answers his question. Right. Is there anybody else? Let me see. Mostly, good morning.
Yeah,
Good
sir,
morning.
there is one more question. Also, do you think the mobilization of grief of the subalternity can form a different level of political movement?
Okay. Mobilization of grief and the subalternity can form a different. What do you mean? What do you mean, Victor, by the mobilization of grief?
I think there should be some more clarity in the question.
Yeah. When I started this presentation, I had mentioned that it would not be a really theoretical talk. Unfortunately, I'm not very good on theory. So,
So we have another question. Whether multiculturalism is insight to the practice of more than one religion and its religious ideology lead to culture or ethnic tension.
okay, the last one. Whether multiculturalism is insight to the practice of more than one religion and its religious ideology lead to what I was saying is multiculturalism, particularly from a South Asian point of view, in the way that we have understood it, leads to tolerance. right? South Asian understanding of multiculturalism is definitely a way that can lead to much more tolerance than a top-down approach as we see in the West today, where from the governmental point of view, or from a civil society point of view, what we see is people are trying to be, the government is trying to take a hand in inculcating multiculturalism among the vast majority of the population. And there are varying dimensions to the success of this strategy, right? Because we are dealing with a populace that is largely unfriendly to this concept. A populace that really doesn't know much about this concept for the simple reason that they have been brought up in a monocultural setting. They have been from their very birth. When we take up issues of racism, race, and all this actually originates in your familial setting, right? It originates in your familial setting where the kind of influences that you are exposed to in a majoritarian framework kind of push you towards suspicion of the other, suspicion of those who look different from you, who might belong to a different ethnic group and a different culture, right? I hope that answers this question. Right. Somebody is saying that the sound is not clear. I hope I'm audible. Right.
Sir, are there any more questions? Anyhow, I have dropped a feedback link. If there are no questions, I think we can move ahead. We've been more than 1 hour. Shall we move ahead with the felicitation, sir, if there are no questions? Sir, there is one question from Murugan Krishnan. The question is, sir, multiculturalism and secularism for today's context in the political level and current situation. I think has already covered the same.
Yeah. The question is not clear.
I think sir has already covered the same.
Yeah. I'm happy to see that so many different, people from all over India here in this chat box. That is very good.
Yeah.
Really encouraging. Yeah.
Sir, if there are no more questions, can we move forward?
Fine.
Yeah. So now moving forward, I request Dr. Nishanti PU to felicitate the function. Madam, please. Dr. Nishanti PU is Associate Professor of Maharaja's College. Madam, please. Madam, you're on mute.
Am I audible
yes,
now? Okay.
Yeah, ma'am. Yeah.
Respected guest of the webinar, Dr. Sam Jacob Kuruvilla, and IQAC coordinator Sri Santosh D. Varghese, and other dignitaries and dear participants. Now, research is an inseparable part of higher education. At the same time, all of us, especially academicians, are always concerned about the quality of research. Research committee of Maharaja's College, along with the IQAC of Maharaja's College, have been conducting series of webinars for improving and enhancing the quality of research. As a researcher, I have been listening to these webinars right from the beginning. And all the webinars are very useful for the researchers and especially to me. And therefore, I take this opportunity to congratulate Research Committee and IQAC of Maharaja's College for conducting this webinar series. And I hope the webinar series would improve the quality of research. And I wish all the success to this webinar series. And thank you very much.
So with this, I think we have come to the end of the third day of the webinar. So I thank Samuel sir for being with us throughout the session and for answering all the questions. I think he has done a wonderful presentation. And I also thank Dr. Nishanti for joining us today and for facilitating the function. Thank you, madam. And thank you, Santosh sir, for giving a wonderful opportunity to organize the webinar. And once again, thank all the participants. Without you all, this session wouldn't have been so dynamic. So thank you all. Thank you once again, Dr. Samuel Jacob Kuruvilla. Hoping that you will be joining us in the future also.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.